previously on the 8-Question Show.
I've heard anecdotally that there are certain states where a lot of the farmland is getting bought up by pharma or tobacco is taking land, and they know, hey, instead of growing tobacco, we're going to be growing cannabis and hemp here and then exporting it, once interstate commerce is possible when the federal policy changes.
Can't afford, that's why I'm front line, hand the sword. I do this all for myself, not the cash or no damn award. I need intelligence to craft my bars. I need the medicine that grows effervescent from the hands of God. I need inheritance to slash the odds, create a pipeline to the well while you grasp for straws. 8 questions, 8 questions, 8 questions, 8 questions, 8 questions, 8 questions, 8 questions.
Welcome back to the 8-Question Show. We have finally gotten here. We've had a fantastic time with our good friend Mike Z, and we've come to the conclusion of our cannabis series. Mike, thank you so much for coming out, kicking in with Brian and I. But we got to ask you this final question. I'm very, very curious. I know you're excited about this one because you're more of a future thinker when it comes to this thing. So what is the future of the marijuana industry?
Well, I don't know.
All right, that's a wrap now.
Cut. Let's go.
No. I mean, well, it depends on how far into the future are we talking about. I think it maybe 10, 20 years from now. And I actually have a whole chapter on it in the book where I make a few predictions. Nothing too controversial. Maybe the most controversial one is that I think dispensaries have no reason to exist. And, maybe 10, 20 years from now, we won't have dispensaries. You'll get your cannabis products the same way you get any other consumer packaged good, whether it's on Amazon or the grocery store or the pharmacy or
Farmers
whatever,
Exactly.
I just don't see a real good reason why cannabis needs its own store, and I get liquor stores or whatever, but I don't know. I just think in the long term, that's going to go away. I think, well, not completely, but it's going to be like a craft specialty store, but it's not going to be like,
it's like a standalone kind of thing.
Yeah. That's one thing. Look, I hope, actually, I don't know. I was going to say, I hope it becomes very mainstream and normal.
Yeah.
But then there's a part of me that doesn't agree with that, because I feel like there's, going back to the spirituality piece and the consciousness, that there's this counterculture element to cannabis that I believe is critically important to preserve. And, going back to the hippies who questioned Vietnam and said, we don't want to fight this war, forget this. And, a lot of that had to do with their cannabis use. And, oh, wow, we can all just get along. Things can be easy and chill. So I don't know. My fear is that it will end up like any other big business, and that we'll have missed this moment to have a consciousness revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think part of the reason we haven't seen that federal legalization is because I think there is fear of how big the impact could be and how much could change. Because what if, people started questioning some of the stuff that we're talking about and started doing more research and diligence on it? I think it would radically alter the way society functions. Now, whether for the good or for to the detriment, who knows? But I think in general, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that risk either way. I think most people are risk averse. I think the industry is projected to grow. I think the numbers are like, a decade from now, it should be like in the ballpark of 60 to 120 billion a year on the legal side. The crazy thing is you still have the traditional market, the illicit, the underground, legacy, whatever you want to call it. Right now is still about probably I don't know, 4 or 5 times bigger than the legal industry. In theory, that those numbers should shift over time. And I do believe that, 20 years from now, it will be as, you'll walk by if there is a dispensary or if there is, edibles being sold at the grocery store or whatever, it's going to feel very normal and unremarkable. But the truth is, no one knows. Even though I think that the cat is not going to come back into the bag. But, that big federal question, how that gets decided could radically alter how this thing looks. Because, if, for example, it was Schedule 2, then that would kind of hand the medical side over to pharma and kind of destroy all of these mom and pop small businesses that actually have this knowledge, the craft, the people who are second or third generation cannabis farmers, how they learn that stuff, through trial and error. And, it's, I think it's really, it's going to be mainstream. And I think there will still be that craft and counterculture element to it, but I don't, the ratio of what that balance will look like, I think is unclear still.
Mike, let me ask you this. Let's say somebody waved a magic wand and said, Mike, you know a lot about this. We want you to be the king of the United States for like 3 years and craft legislation surrounding cannabis in the way that you feel would make it work perfectly.
Wow.
What would be some changes if you had that magic wand that you think could kind of let this phase in go well? And
it's not a pressure, Mike.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
You're the king for 3 years.
What a great question. Give me all your cannabis.
Let me taste it. This goes in the right pile of bullshits.
That's an amazing question. I think first and foremost, there's this whole big debate. We didn't get into today in great detail, but the whole question of restorative justice and equity and access and all that stuff. And, I've mentioned a little bit the harm that cannabis prohibition has caused. And there's a lot of talk in the industry about how do we create equity and how do we restore the harm, and policymakers and corporate cannabis certainly give it lip service, but I don't think nearly enough has been done in that. And I have one very, what I believe to be a simple, elegant solution that I've told senators, I've told policymakers, no one likes this idea for whatever reason. Perhaps because it would be too effective or too successful. But, I believe that prohibition institutionalized the harm of certain communities. And so legalization should institutionalize investment in those communities. And to an extent, this is happening. For example, in New York, part of the new adult use cannabis regime is, we're going to give a certain amount of licenses to these impacted people. We're going to give them certain benefits. We're going to reinvest a certain portion of the tax revenue in those communities, which sounds great on the surface. But when you dig into how implementation actually happens, there's a lot of room for, well, what I'll say, fuckery. For example, in LA, where they had a social equity program and the revenue was supposed to go to reinvestment in communities and, all of this stuff that sounds really great. A lot of the money went to the LAPD. Which is not, in theory, keeping the community safe or whatever, but in practice, is that going to restore the harm of these communities that were ravaged by, the war on drugs? No, absolutely not. And so what I would do, one thing I would do is make it so any family that was justice impacted by cannabis when it was, clearly the punishment didn't match the action, they should be given some kind of either financial restitution Or what I believe would be a good in-between point is give them scholarships. Let them go get the same way that veterans get, all these benefits. Give these people who are casualties of the war on drugs, where the government was the perpetrator, let the government fund their education or something of that nature, so that, I'm a big believer that education is a way to level up, to if you want to pull yourself up in the world, that Horatio Alger's by the bootstraps, whatever thing, education is a way to do that.
Absolutely.
And so, I think anyone who's been first of all, what am I saying? The obvious thing, I can't believe I missed it. Before that, there's people who are still in jail for cannabis. Most of them nonviolent offenders. Let's get all of those people out of jail immediately.
Mm. It's funny. I wanted to check the source before I even said this on air. Jamie Foxx's father, he had this story. He's from Texas. Says father taught him how to play tennis. Father taught him how to throw a football, all of that. Gets pulled over, and they find $25 worth of I think either he said illegal substance. I think he was in the United Kingdom when he said it, but it was weed probably.
What year was this?
This was when he was a child. He just specified a year.
So that was like 3 pounds back then.
$25. So the $25. He goes to present his court. He thinking I'm probably gonna get maybe probation, maybe if anything 3 months in jail, whatever. Judge gives him 7 years.
7?
7.
Oh my God! He missed his kids growing up
in a federal prison for $25 worth. Documented $25 worth of weed on him, and they gave him 7 years. So, like you said, but this is why I was telling you earlier in the previous show, where I have a friend who she's going to be the chief legal officer of this cannabis business. But they gave this person who was doing it so much incentives to do so in New York State because he was federally convicted of a marijuana crime, and he's had at minimum 2 years of business experience. So they're trying to clean it up in a sense by giving certain or major incentives for, like, okay, $25, 7 years. That's crazy.
It's criminal.
Right. Some people who got pulled over with the joints worth of weed, 5 years.
I met a guy weeks ago. We work in financial services. This guy ran circles around me in knowledge of economics. I said, you should consider working in our industry. Do you have a college degree? Yes, I have a college degree. I go, so what's stopping you? He goes, well, when I was 19, I got caught with an ounce of weed, so I have a federal drug offense on my record. And I was like, well, you're not. That's it. Like, there goes that. So a brilliant mind that would have been making great money in that industry, that entire opportunity is completely scrubbed out now because
That's crazy.
He had some pot on him when he was 19.
Yep. 19. I mean, listen. Soup, producer extraordinaire, Brian, Mike. We've all done some dumb shit when we were 19 years old. 19?
Yeah.
It was like a blur for me.
Yeah, I don't even remember what. I know it was bad, but I don't even remember what happened.
I remember my 19-year-old year. Yeah. So, I mean, come on, really, like.
So to snub out an entire life
industry
of,
because of that at 19. Everybody done some.
That's a great point, Mike. I mean, to first and foremost heal the things that have been tarnished as a result of its prohibition.
Yeah, for sure.
I give you a lot of credit for recognizing that first, because I immediately went to like, hey, how do you make money on this? Completely forgetting about all the harm that was done. And your book points this out a lot. Like, don't be one of these people that if this is an industry you're interested in, that you just jump in, you're like, all right, I'm here to make money, baby. Forgetting that, like, there were so many people that suffered.
Yeah.
That suffered.
And are still suffering.
and they're still suffering.
But I think that's why it's so
behind bars,
nuanced too.
Yep.
I was funny, like, you know, with in terms of like the future of the industry. I may be optimistic. I see a positive one, but I understand how nuanced and difficult it is because, like you said, you have people in California who grow, or Colorado who has hundreds of acres of weed growing, and then you have the people in Colorado jails who was locked up because they had, you know, $10 worth of weed on them, and now they can't get into the industry in that state because of the conviction. And it's funny, and and this goes back to the previous episode in terms of like the future of the industry and how they see things, the legality of it, because a lot of things. So when things are smuggled to the U.S., does it fund other illegal operations too? So think about, you know how like on CNN they're like, we found 4 tons of weed in a coffee case. And what if, and they're like, what, you know, a shipping container on California has 4 tons of weed, and it obviously wasn't meant to be found or whatever. But imagine if weed in America federally is illegal, and they smuggle it to America, and that's legal, and now it funds illegal things back where they are, because now they can set up a.
But would you need it? Would you even need it then? If it was federally legal, then would the illegal alternative really be that attractive anymore?
It makes all your fronts legitimately legal.
I see. What are your thoughts?
But that's the future. But anyways, but yeah, so I see how nuanced the future could be, because it's like the people in jail who only got convicted of weed, who was running an entire weed operation, got 25 to life. And they're like, okay, now it's legal, so now people can come in, create an entire lifestyle, become billionaires potentially in the future with this whole thing. But then it's like, but then now they have lawyers who are like my friend Jess, shout out to Jess, who's like, wait a minute, if you allow this person now in 2022 to do whatever they need to do,
precedence.
What about so-and-so back in 1983 who only had a weed conviction? You got to give them the same opportunity you just gave them.
Yeah. So
I see how nuanced it is.
To that point, there's a lot of the states are expunging records and sealing convictions, but on the federal level, none of that has happened yet. Maybe one day with legalization.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
But I also, if I were the king, I would make it. I would make it so there was no bad cannabis, so that everyone had really dank, high quality weed. And I say that somewhat in jest, but what I really mean is I think there needs to be some kind of quality standards and consumer protections, because right now that 1,000%. Still does. Even some of the legal states, some of them don't require testing, and some of them, even the ones that do, sometimes you still end up having bad products get in front of consumers, which is, in my judgment, like unacceptable, especially if you have medical patients and you're getting them selling a moldy product. It's ridiculous. And one last thing, I would have insurance cover medical cannabis. So anyone who needs cannabis medicine for anything,
100%,
that should be covered by insurance like any other medicine.
The quality control mechanism, very briefly, goes back to question 3 for the education, because people, think about it. It's like in our industry. Think about people that we're in finance. So if we're in finance and somebody who doesn't know a thing about finance tries to regulate us, how can they without knowing it?
How can they do it without knowing
it? So now you have this whole budding industry where the education component in an education institution is very, very new. But the people who hey, Chris, you're now in charge of the regulation and quality control of cannabis. And I'm like, I don't know.
There was some dude
I don't
like
know
2
shit
years
about
ago,
this.
he hated it. Yeah.
And like, that's a little bit too green. So just make sure you make it a little,
There's crystals all over this. Yeah, no, throw it out.
Yeah, exactly. So I think before
smells like a skunk.
Why does this smell like this? This has to be bad. So,
throw it out.
But it's almost like the regulation and the quality and control of it. It should be a requirement. They go through the educational piece, so they know what's good, what's bad, what to look for, what not to look for, things like that. But man,
Mike, this was fun, man.
This has been phenomenal.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
100%. I know our listeners out there and our watchers, our viewers out there who are visual are going to love this conversation. And they're going to learn a lot about the cannabis industry in and of itself.
I hope so.
You know, I mean, listen, listeners, viewers, get the book. You'll learn a lot about this. Brian has read it. I have not, unfortunately. But
and Mike, how do our listeners follow your work, follow the content that you put out?
Yeah, you could find me at Hi Mike Z on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn, Michael Zaitsev. And yeah, that's the easiest way. And if you're considering a cannabis degree with LIM College, limcollege.edu/cannabis. So, yeah.
This concludes our cannabis series. We will see you all next time.